Good morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well today. A couple things I want to get to first before we get started into our next chapter. First and foremost, we won't be having a discussion board this week, but what we will have is your second reflection paper. I'm going to post a Dropbox up on As You Learn, as well as set up an email to just remind you of the submission procedures. Obviously, keep context within terms of grammar, in terms of style, whether you use MLA, APA, or Chicago in this case, because those are going to be the three most common for you to use. So please make sure you submit that by Friday, by midnight. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Again, I'm more than happy to talk through any paper that you have. I won't be able to obviously grade it, but between then. But at the same time, I will be able to make a couple notes and say, what we can do to improve on your papers. Because, like I said, a lot of y'all did very well in your papers. I think some of y'all probably might want to improve your grade for the next one. And like I said, all this is through a learning process of, just continuously getting better in terms of your writing. So, again, I'm going to be pretty strict about that, making sure everything is there, making sure your arguments are there, making sure that you use Cialdini and Woodward and Denton for logical fallacies, as well as the weapons of influence by Cialdini. Those are going to be really important to include, so make sure you don't skip out on those. Make sure you cite when necessary. If you've got other citations outside of it, please use those. That's what they're here for. Okay, so like I said, that's going to be due by Friday. The other thing I want to mention is be thinking about these communication theories. I know I mentioned this before, and it's something I talked about on Friday, but they are very important. I really want you to make sure that you're on ball with these communication theories for your final paper, as well as your third paper, because you might want to find a hole or a missing link to this particular theory or theories, whatever you may want to try to do. And again, that's something to ask me questions about. So today, we're going to do something a little bit different in terms of we're going to be covering over, instead of the intrapersonal communication and that bridge from intra to interpersonal communication, we're going to be talking about interpersonal persuasion. And there are 5 main types of those, and I'm going to go over those pretty quickly. But we're also going to talk about the difference between face-to-face communication versus computer-mediated communication. We'll talk about verbal versus nonverbal. We'll talk about power, compliance gaining, conflict. We're probably not going to be able to get through everything today just because, I've probably got about an hour or an hour and a half of content here. But, I usually only keep these to 15 to 30 minutes long in this case. So just kind of bear with me. I'll be posting another video on Tuesday. And then Thursday is Cognitive Dissonance Day for Theory Thursday. I'm really looking forward to that. So anyway, let's talk about interpersonal persuasion. And there are 5 main types that Woodward and Denton mention, and it's dynamic, interactive, proactive, contextual, and intense. So I'll go over each one of those and mention kind of how they work. So first and foremost, we have dynamic, which is sending communication messages continually. So this often parallels with the transactive model of communication. So if you've ever seen it, it actually works in the sense of it's like a Venn diagram where there's communicator A and communicator B, and we have these levels of expertise that we put together. I don't know if there's any space in between here that you can see, but they create this Venn diagram of shared level of expertise between the two. And so that's where a lot of communication comes into play in terms of your expertise versus another expertise. The other thing that's interesting about this, and why it differs from the second one, which is called interactive, is that communication is continual, which means it is constantly going. They really do account for, instead of just the verbal message that interactive might talk about, it's talking about the nonverbal messages as well. So what this means is, you can go up to somebody and they have a stubborn look on their face, their arms are crossed, and generally they have this pattern on their face of, I really do not want to be talked to right now. And so, again, that's kind of a consideration with this dynamic approach in terms of knowing going in what the communication standpoint is like. Or if someone's irritated or excited, they may move, for excited, they may move closer, they might smile, where that communication is apparent even when another person is giving their information or they're sending the verbal message in this case. This differs from interactive because interactive understands roles of both sender and receiver. So they deal with a lot of what is called the interactive model of communication. I'm taking kind of a step back here, where it's basically saying, here's your sender, here's your receiver. You have a communication pattern that goes from point A, sender, to point B, receiver. But where it differs from the linear model of communication is there's an interactive loop back in terms of this interaction where there's feedback. So again, here's the first message come to the receiver. Receiver receives said message and gives a feedback message back to him. So that's where interactive comes into play. Proactive, in this case, is really interesting because we deal with something called phenomenology. And phenomenology, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you all before, but phenomenology is this case of understanding a different person's perspective of things clearly by communicating with them. Their idea for proactive is understanding that you will never be able to step in the shoes that this other person is in. I look at my family, I look at my colleagues, I look at my students and say, whatever it is you're going through, whatever it is you're doing, I cannot completely understand everything that's going on because my empathy only works so far. And even then, the situations at hand will stop to some extent with empathy as well. This is why empathy is really hard, because you might say, I feel your pain, I feel your issues, I understand where you're coming from. You might sit there and say, no, you do not. And so the proactive approach approaches that phenomenology, in that we need to listen and communicate our experiences with one another to understand each other's perspective. And to a lot of scholars in this case within phenomenology, saying this is the only true way you can communicate. So that's proactive. The next one is contextual, environmental and contextual influence interaction. And this is big because you might sit there and say, not only personal environment, so you could think of a loud room, for instance. You could think of what we're doing right now. In fact, when it comes to contextual communication, it's really interesting through like via Skype or FaceTime or even just an online recording. One of the things you'll understand with this is that the research within contextual communication and interpersonal persuasion is that within FaceTime, there's the notion in terms of looking at the people, and I'm sorry, I'm going to put my hand, that is undoubtedly going to be the thumbnail, I guarantee it. Looking at what's on screen here versus me looking into the actual camera in terms of making eye contact. And that, in many ways, actually confuses people in terms of who they should be looking at, because naturally I look at the people on screen, when in reality what I should be doing is looking at the camera to try to make eye contact. Eye contact for a lot of people is extremely important, even when it comes to this area of communication, when it comes to computer-mediated communication. The other thing may be contextual in terms of how you feel about a certain person given a period of time. And so you may be upset with somebody, you may be angry with somebody, you may be excited with somebody, and that will influence positively, negatively, or not really much at all in terms of this persuasion. If you're really excited to see somebody, you may be inclined to go somewhere that you may not really have much intention to go to. So I went to Seattle at one point, and I wanted to go to a particular brewery that my friend has been to quite a few times. But the fact that I was there, the fact that he was kind of the host, he said, let's do it. Even though he had been there a couple times, and even though it was something that he may not have really wanted to do in this case. The last one is called intense, and this is producing weakness, rejection, maybe withdrawal. This is some heavy communication here, and it may deal with your manipulation or coercion in terms of being vulnerable. And this is really interesting because I've often seen this particular example, not only with research, but anecdotally, in terms of people that say, I'm never going to see this person again, therefore I don't feel bad about opening up to this particular person. Because if you're for the long haul with somebody, that may be difficult because you do face rejection. I mean, think about coming out discourse. And not just, coming out of the closet, as you would say, a person might admit that or would talk about that they're a homosexual in this case, because that's the kind of the general talking point within coming out. But at the same time, there's a lot of ways we can come out in some way, and that's hard, and it's difficult in terms of the discourse because we feel that face of rejection. And so if you have been saying that you're a particular way, your identity has this particular ideology, and then all of a sudden you say, I have been living a way that isn't me in this case. And so that's that intenseness. Now, if you're talking to somebody you'll never see again, that intense conversation may feel vulnerable or weak, but at the same time you don't face that rejection in this point. The other thing I want to mention, my wife is going to the doctor, so I just wanted to make sure that wasn't anything there. The next thing I want to talk about, so those are your interpersonal persuasion elements. The other thing I want to talk about is face-to-face versus computer-mediated communication. So face-to-face often is considered this golden standard when it comes to communication. We often say, the best way to communicate with somebody, to persuade somebody, is through face-to-face. I mean, and we see this all the time in terms of breakup. Literature talks about how people feel when it comes to if, someone is going to break up with their significant other. It's almost like the absolute worst thing you could possibly do is break up via text, according to a lot of data when it comes to interpersonal interviews with subjects that have gone through breakups. And so if they've been broken up by text, they feel that's very impersonal and difficult, even though I've heard arguments to say, well, if I'm ending the relationship, I don't want to have uncomfortable communication with both parties, then that may be the way to do it. Now, granted, take that with a grain of salt. Don't quote me on that either, because, again, this was just a discussion point, and a lot of people during this discussion were still pretty upset with the ideology of breaking up via computer or phone or something like that. So, again, that's all part of it. But, again, we know the ideology of face-to-face and this gold standard, and I do like to look at weaknesses of computer-mediated communication and face-to-face, because we might talk about what are some of the things that CMC does that face-to-face doesn't. So a couple things I'm going to mention is the notion of proximity. Proximity is nice because, when we're close together to somebody, communication is relatively easy. I can just go to somebody's office, but for a lot of you, you live in Hickory, you live in Morganton, you live, you don't live in this particular area in Boone, and so communication may be difficult, but the element of email, the element of these online lectures may help us in terms of what we can do to help this kind of communication. So that's an obvious role for CMC. The other thing that may come up is asynchronous communication. Which many people say, well, asynchronous communication is kind of a weakness because, there is the notion of I get all the time in the world to proceed with whatever message I want to distribute to, my significant other or, just a friend or something like that. I give this so much time to think, whereas when they're interpersonal, I get their real reaction. Which I often argue, we always talk about think before you speak as a maxim here, and that's a benefit for computer-mediated communication. The last thing I'll mention is kind of a weakness and a strength, is anonymity. And many people, when they consider anonymity, they look at some of the discourse they might find, like, for example, on 4chan, or even some YouTube comment sections of some of the meanest things you'll ever read in your entire life. And it's difficult to read those, and it's hard to try to be able to understand, what goes through a person's mind to say such crude and terrible things. But there's also a notion of what I just mentioned before in terms of the intense interpersonal persuasion, in that anonymity can be a very strong thing when we don't want to be identified in sharing vulnerable information about ourselves. So, coming out literature might be one thing, but there might be tendencies where a person might be suicidal, for instance, and they don't have anybody to talk to because they feel like if I were to talk to my parents, if I were to talk to a boss, they wouldn't be able to understand what I was going through in this case. So talking to a stranger in this case might actually be a benefit. There's actually a really cool link of just that on Reddit, where somebody, they made this challenge, and one thing that came up was this person kind of sent a bit of a macabre message on Reddit, and they said it kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the person said, all jokes aside, we hope you're doing okay, and let us know if we can help. But these are complete strangers, and there ended up being a really cool thread of conversation between several of these people that said, look, whatever it is you're going through, we're here to help, and we may have been there before, and that's powerful. It's so strong to be able to have that kind of support group, and people, again, you may not even know. But it is a good thing in terms of, I engaged with vulnerable discourse within online gaming, where, again, I was going through a rough time, and I wasn't going through that rough time or anything like that, but, tough communication, bullying, that kind of thing, going through middle school, and having those people that, again, I had no idea who they are in person, really helped me out in terms of people I could feel comfortable talking to. So that's heavy. We're getting through a lot of heavy stuff here. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about 4 last things before I stop. 2 of them have to do with what's called verbal versus nonverbal communication. And this is stuff you've all heard before. But I'll talk about a couple of these as we go along. First and foremost, through verbal communication, we're talking about symbols, once again, through the ideology of word choice. So, again, words matter. We're talking about connotative versus denotative meaning. We're talking about brute facts that may be the object of something or a representation of that object, symbols, that kind of thing. And how much can the verbal we have versus the nonverbal that's attached? How much can that make an influence? And so we see this a lot in computer-mediated communication, where half of my text messages, look at my phone of my most used emoticons, and the one where that's like the winky face with the tongue sticking out is one of my most used, because I'm rarely serious, and I like to give my friends a hard time, and vice versa. They like to give me a hard time. And so I always want to convey, though, I'm not mad at them, I'm joking. And that can be hard to do with a complete verbal interaction, in this case, without a little bit of nonverbal gesture with the use of an emoticon in this case. So verbal is a powerful thing when it doesn't have nonverbals attached. And so we can say we're going to pay attention to the message itself, and that is not easy because we think of context, we think of the person delivering, we have scripts of reactions that we plan on using after something is said. There's so much to come into play because of nonverbals, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them. There's a lot of them, but there's 6 of them that I talk about frequently. Proxemics, haptics, chronemics, silence, kinesics, and paralanguage. I'll talk about those here. And what do they do? And what is the strength weaknesses? Some of my personal favorite ones is proxemics. Proxemics is really cool because we're talking about space. Now, I mentioned space in terms of faraway distances, like my brother-in-laws who still live in Buffalo, New York. We play fantasy hockey, and that's the way I keep up with them. I'm talking about physical distance from each other, maybe in the same location. So there's a lot of interesting studies that talk about Proxemics in terms of sitting on a bus or getting on an elevator. Where do you stand when you get on an elevator? What if someone stands right next to you when you're the only person in the elevator? There's even bathroom studies in terms of where you stand for a urinal. I know that's a little crass of me to say something like that, but at the same time, those proxemics are difficult in terms of how close do I want somebody to be there? Because this is like expectation violation theory, where, and for the most part, if I'm sitting on a bus, I'm the only one there, and then it almost happens regularly in movie theaters. I'm the only one sitting there, and then somebody decides to sit right in front of me, or in the same row, or sometimes even a couple of chairs down from me in the same row. And I'm like, what are you doing? There's a whole theater that you can approach. Why are you sitting next to me or near me? In this case, I want my space. And so, which I can be kind of obnoxious about that in terms of space. But the notion is, again, the expectation violation. I'll sit there and say, I'm going to ask you a question, or I'm going to move myself. But it may be different if it's like the object of your affection. If it's somebody that's really attractive to you, you may say, okay, that's not so bad. Other things are haptics in terms of physical touch. Where do you like being touched? You may not like being touched. Some people are very touchy-feely in terms of they like giving hugs. And other people are just like, just stay away from me. I might give you a handshake, but I like to keep my distance. And you might sit there and say, even with, you might have certain roles, like if you're intimate with somebody, a significant other, or a spouse or something, you may obviously have more roles in terms of touch, whereas, family members, you may say, okay, handshake, my hands, that's okay, upper back, that's okay, maybe the shoulder, that's okay. Other than that, stay away. And that may be one of those areas where that's not welcome touching in this case. Other thing is kinesics, like body language, in terms of, people will talk about being open to conversation when you cross your arms like this. Kinesics can also deal with oculesics in terms of your eye contact with people and how valuable that is with somebody. These are all gestures that may come into play. Other things may be paralanguage in terms of, I've got office mates both here and back, so I'm not going to actually demonstrate paralanguage, but it's the actual volume that you use and the emphasis on certain words. Silence is very important in terms of how you use silence. We've all heard of the silent treatment that we might give to somebody, and for a lot of us who are big talkers like myself, the silent treatment is unbearable. Now, thankfully, my wife does not use that as a weapon against me, and vice versa. I don't do that because I'm like, what a cruel and unusual method of torture for somebody, especially for someone who likes to talk like myself and my wife in this case. Chronemics is in terms of how we use time. Those are really important as well. The last thing I'll talk about within nonverbal communication, and I really want to post some videos that I love about this, is the notion of power and how we use power non-verbally and verbally, in this case in terms of the messages we use. Two of my favorite examples of use of power is how we demonstrate space. And there's a example within Harry Potter, for instance, where two professors, I believe it's Dolores Umbridge and McGonagall, Minerva McGonagall, I can't remember, where they constantly move up steps during their conversation, and you can see power being distributed as somebody rises within that steps of, looking down at somebody versus being on even playing fields. That's really cool. My favorite one, though, is a recent one from Game of Thrones in terms of nonverbal power. And it's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 people. One is, there's coming up to a long table. And I'm going to show you this video, but I'm going to talk about it real quick here. They're coming to this long table. The main person who's conducting the meeting naturally sits at the end of the table. And then there are 5 chairs lined up on the side. So what happens is the three people who are usually accustomed to these meetings, they all kind of rush in to try to sit next to the person with the most power. So the lineage of who comes up to most power in terms of who's being quick. So now we've got one person at the head of the table, three sitting down on this particular side, and two empty chairs. The next two people that walk in, one takes the chair, picks it up, moves all the way around the table so that we've got three here, one at the end, and then one on the other side sitting next to that person. So it's basically saying I'm giving myself more space. In this case, I'm still sitting next to the person who has the most power, but I'm not with the rest of these three over here. And so you sit there and say, that's a good move. That's a good power move in this case. Whereas the next person, this is our friend Tyrion Lannister, if you watch Game of Thrones, takes the chair, drags it, very loudly I might add, and sits it at the other end of the table. So again, long rectangle table, one here, three here, one here, and then on the other side, now there's another person there. And this is a cool way of conveying power in terms of space and location, to where he's sitting and saying, you no longer have the massive power that you think you have. I've got more space. I'm sitting at the other end of the table. I have just as much power as you do in this case. And we'll talk more about this, not only in terms of culture, but gender as well on Tuesday. So I'm going to run over here in a few minutes. That's all I'm going to go over today. I'll talk a little bit more about compliance gaining and conflict on tomorrow. And again, make sure that you are getting ready for your reflection paper. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks.